In this video, we begin our discussion on Chapter 6, where, overall in this chapter, we seek to examine how responsive consumers are to change by considering the price elasticity of demand, cross-price elasticity of demand, and income elasticity of demand. Where, in today's discussion of the price elasticity of demand, we'll do so by setting up some preliminaries to then discuss elasticity, the price elasticity of demand, then conclude with an example. Beginning with our preliminaries, in our discussion of consumer choice, we have examined the choices available to consumers, measured and examined their preferences, to then explain how they make decisions. This then allowed us to derive product demand for individual goods and services. Now we seek to examine how responsive consumers are to change. That is, if price on a good or service changes, then by how much does quantity demanded decrease? If the price of good Y changes, then does demand for good X increase or decrease, and by how much? And lastly, if income changes, then does demand for a good or service increase or decrease, and by how much? Where the answer to these three questions will serve the purpose of quantifying how responsive consumers are to different types of changes, as well as to classify good types based off of the responses to these changes. And in order to answer these three questions, we will consider three different forms of elasticity with respect to product demand, where elasticity is going to be a measured response between two economic variables in percentage terms. Mathematically, that is, elasticity is equal to the percentage change in Y divided by the percentage change in X. And observe that elasticity then is just the slope formula but given in percentage terms, in that we have the change in Y divided by the change in X, standard slope formula, but then now we're just adding this in terms of percentage terms. Where in terms of overall calculating elasticity, the percentage change in X is going to be calculated as the change in a variable divided by the average of that variable, where the change is going to be x2 minus x1, our standard slope calculation, and for y it would be y2 minus y1. And in regards to finding the average of the variable, it's going to be x1 plus x2 divided by 2, and if we did this for y, it would be y1 plus y2 divided by 2. We put the two together and divide it through. That gives us that percentage change in X. We do that for our two variables and divide through. We get our slope in percentage terms, or in other words, elasticity. So then, in terms of elasticity as well, we're going to report this in absolute value, and there will be three response types to consider. The first case will be the elastic response, which occurs when elasticity is greater than 1 in absolute value and carries the interpretation of a 1% change in X has a greater than 1% change in Y. Our second case will be the unitary elastic response, which occurs when elasticity is equal to 1 in absolute value and carries the interpretation of a 1% change in X has a 1% change in Y. And then lastly, we have the inelastic response type, which occurs when elasticity is less than 1 in absolute value and has the interpretation of a 1% change in X has a less than 1% change in Y. Now turning our attention towards the price elasticity of demand, this is going to be the percentage change in quantity demanded divided by the percentage change in price, or mathematically, this is going to be the slope of the product demand curve in percentage terms, that is, the percentage change in quantity demanded divided by the percentage change in price, and is interpreted as a 1% change in price leads to a beta percent change in quantity demanded, where this is reported in absolute value since the inverse relationship between quantity demanded and price is well understood. But also observe that the price elasticity of demand also measures a change in quantity demanded since we are considering movement along the product demand curve. And since we're considering the product demand curve then, from a consumer perspective, the price elasticity of demand is going to be shaped by the product demand curve and is influenced by the determinants of demand as well, where four factors of note will be: is the good a necessary good or not? Are there substitutes available? What is the price corresponding to the amount of income this consumer is generating? And what is the time available in terms of prices being able to adjust? Where the more a good is needed in a consumer's everyday life, the more they will not be able to respond to price changes, that is, having an inelastic response. Whereas the more goods there are that fulfill the same role of a particular good, the more responsive consumers will be to price changes, that is, an elastic response, in that if price increases, then that means they can just switch to an alternative. how expensive the good is with respect to their income. The cheaper it is, the less sensitive they will be, since it's not too much in terms of their overall income process. Whereas if we look at a big ticket item such as a car, which will typically cost a substantial amount compared to how much a consumer is generating, they will be more sensitive to price changes. And then lastly, with respect to time, the more time there is for prices to adjust, the more sensitive consumers will be to price changes, or they will have an elastic response. So then with this in mind, let us keep those determinants in mind as well as our response types and go through our three cases. Beginning first, we'll consider the elastic response type, where we have a product demand curve on the right, and notice that it's horizontal and we have 2 points A and B that we also have on our demand schedule. So the elastic response type will come to be when goods are luxuries and there's various substitutes available, where one such instance will be a new car, in that a new car is a luxury good, in that if somebody needs a means of transportation for everyday life, there's going to be used cars available. There's also going to be motorcycles, there's going to be bikes, etc., and there's also public transportation available. And in regards to substitutes, there's going to be various brands and makes in terms of new cars that are being offered, but also mentioned there's going to be the used cars available, and there's also going to be other instances of transportation such as motorcycles as well. And in terms of calculating the response type, we're going to turn to our product demand curve as well as our schedule and consider points going from A to B. That is going from A to B, left to right, and we see that quantity is going to go from 2 to 6, and that our price point is going to stay from $6 to $6. So in terms of our price elasticity of demand and absolute value, we're going to see that our value is equal to infinity, and this is going to be due to the percentage change in price equaling 0, and the percentage change in quantity equaling 1, such that when we have 1 divided by 0, our value is going to be infinity in absolute value. And what this means is that a 1% change in price will lead to an infinite percentage change in quantity demanded, or in that if price increases, then demand will go down to 0. And this is the perfectly elastic response, which is an extreme type of the elastic response type. Now moving on to our second case, we have the unitary elastic response type, where in terms of our product demand curve, observe that we have a more traditional downward sloping demand curve, and we have our 2 points A and B at a quantity level of 3 and 6, where the price points are 6 and 3 respectively. The unitary elastic response type is going to come to be when there's goods with some substitutes available, and where one such instance will be private education. Education itself may be viewed as a necessary good, but there's going to be public education that most people have access to, so private education is not necessary in that regards. And in regards to substitutes, there may be a few private education institutions around in a particular area that are being offered, but also there's the public option that's available for everybody as well. And then in terms of calculating the response type, we're going to turn to our product demand curve as well as our schedule, and we're going to consider movement from point A to B. So a change in quantity demand that leads to rightward movement along our product demand curve, in which quantity demand is going from 3 to 6 due to price decreasing from 6 to 3. If we were to calculate our price elasticity of demand, in absolute value, it would have a value of -1. And this is going to be due to our percentage change in price being 0.67, whereas our percentage change in quantity demanded having a value of -0.67, such that -0.67 divided by 0.67 gives us that -1, or in absolute value we have 1. And so the interpretation here is going to be that a 1% change in price leads to a 1% change in quantity demanded, otherwise known as the unitary elastic response. Lastly, let us go to our last response type, in which we have the inelastic response type. We have a product demand curve on the right, where notice we have a vertical product demand curve. We have 2 points A and B, and in terms of our schedule, quantity is going to be 4 for each point, but the price point is going to be 8 for A and $2 for point B. The inelastic response type is going to come to be in which a good is a necessary good and there's going to be little substitutes available. Or one example would be pharmaceuticals, in that if a consumer needs a pharmaceutical for everyday use in order to treat or prevent an illness, then there's not going to be much they can do if the price changes, and this is only going to worsen if the manufacturer of this particular pharmaceutical has a copyright in which they're the exclusive manufacturer for some time period. And then in terms of calculating the response type, we can turn to our product demand curve and look at movements from point B to point A, where our price elasticity of demand in absolute value is going to have a value of 0, and this is going to be due to our percentage change in price having a value of negative 1.2, while our percentage change in quantity is going to equal 0, so 0 divided by 1.2, giving us a value of 0, or that a 1% change in price will lead to a 0% change in quantity demanded, and this is going to be a perfectly inelastic response type, which is an extreme case of the inelastic response type. So then, now that we have some intuition on the price elasticity of demand, let us return to our example of the consumer going to the grocery store for a post-workout meal of ground beef and brown rice that we've been using in our discussion of consumer choice, and in this case we'll consider brown rice for the example, where in terms of brown rice, food is a necessity, and brown rice is a staple in many people's diets. Not only that, brown rice is a carbohydrate source, but does have some substitutes in the form of potatoes and pasta, and is relatively low priced overall, and particularly compared to its substitutes. And lastly, it is not very adjustive in terms of price, so with all this information in mind, would we expect the response type for brown rice to be inelastic, elastic, or unitary elastic? So let us find out. If the price of brown rice goes from $4 to $8, what response type does the consumer have in terms of the price elasticity of demand? We have our product demand curve on the right. We have 2 points A and B, and we see that at point A, brown rice is at a quantity of 2, the price point is $8. At point B, the quantity level is 3, and the price point is $4. We know that we're considering movement from point B to A, since we have a price increase from 4 to 8, where price is 4 at point B and price is 8 at point A. We also know that we need a price elasticity of demand in absolute value, so the percentage change in quantity demanded divided by the percentage change in price, where once again the percentage change in a variable is going to be the change in that variable divided by the average of that variable, where the change in the variable is going to be x2 minus x1, where in this case x2 is going to be point A and x1 is going to be point B. And in terms of the average, this is going to be x2 plus x1 divided by 2, where once again x2 is going to be point A and x1 is going to be point B. And so in regards to our steps, to find the price elasticity of demand and its interpretation, we need to find the average price between point B and A, find the change in the price between point B and A, then find the percentage change in the price between B and A, then repeat steps 1 through 3 for quantity demanded, calculate the price elasticity of demand, and then interpret. So let us begin. In terms of average price, this is going to be the price point of point A and B, so 4 plus 8 divided by 2, or 12 divided by 2, giving us a value of 6. In terms of the percentage change in price, x2 minus x1, we know that x2 is A, x1 is B, and in terms of price, that then means 8 minus 4, giving us a value of 4. So then in terms of constructing our percentage change in price, this is going to be the change in price divided by the average price, so 4 divided by 6, giving us a value of 0.67. And then now repeating the same, but for brown rice in terms of quantity demanded, average brown rice is going to be brown rice at point A and B divided by 2, or 2 plus 3 divided by 2, giving us a value of 2.5. Now finding the change in brown rice, this is going to be point A minus point B, or 2 minus 3, giving us a value of -1, such that when we construct the percentage change in brown rice, this is going to be the change divided by the average, -1 divided by 2.5, giving us a value of -0.4, so that when we construct our price elasticity of demand, -0.4 divided by 0.67 gives us a value of 0.6 in absolute value, or since it's less than 1 in terms of interpretation, it's an inelastic response where a 1% change in price leads to a 0.6% change in quantity demanded.